Hello again, everyone. This is Dr. Moore. This presentation and our discussions this week cover the chapters on emotions and thinking. Emotions in conflict is a very important chapter because we need to be able to effectively manage our emotions in order to successfully resolve conflict. Strong emotions are both a cause of and a result of conflict. Emotions such as anger, distrust, disappointment, frustration, confusion, and fear often mask substantive underlying issues in a dispute. After we talk about ideas on how to understand and work with emotions, we'll turn to the analysis of conflicts. This will address how you think about your conflicts. This analysis uses a wide lens, also called a macro level or system perspective, and a small lens view, called a micro level analysis. Thoughts and feelings are interrelated, which is why I've decided to combine these two chapters in this unit. As the authors of the text note, we are feeling as well as thinking creatures. To reflect a little more deeply on the previous quote, both emotional engagement and rational reasoning are important in conflict resolution. We want to integrate thinking and feeling. When there is both a concrete solution and a sense of emotional resolve, conflicts are more successfully dealt with. We simply can't ignore feelings. And when I talk about emotional resolve or emotional resolution, that's the way the participants feel about the conflicts. It's the emotional energy. The emotional content of the conflict needs to be resolved. In this unit, we'll see how both the head and the heart play an important role. There's always an emotional dimension to conflict. Whenever we're in conflict, feelings are activated, and conflicts are not resolved when the other person feels misunderstood. Accurately reflecting the feelings of the other person during a conflict by saying you seem angry or you seem confused, for example, is important and challenging. It takes a degree of emotional intelligence to effectively understand and interpret and then mirror another person's emotions. It shows you understand and it validates their feelings. It's also important to reflect as it gives the other person a chance to correct or clarify your understanding of their feelings. Emotions are states of feeling. They are like moving water. They change. We feel them. They influence us. The authors teach that feelings are facts. They exist. They aren't right or wrong. It is important to be aware of them. Feelings help us to recognize safety and danger. They're important in helping us to adapt to the environment. And fear and anxiety often influence our choices in managing conflict. Fear can create a tunnel vision where we focus on a threat or a perceived threat and we don't see what else is going on. So at this point, let me stress a couple of very important points. Conflict always occurs on an emotional dimension. Emotions have important functions, and they influence conflict resolution. States of emotional arousal are labeled as different feelings depending on what we believe to be true. Feelings are connected to our cognitive appraisal of a situation. In other words, what we think of a situation affects how we feel about it. And conflict transformation occurs when we get new information, when we practice empathy by accurately reflecting another person's feelings, and when we remain open to other points of view. Before we go further, I want to mention a couple of myths about emotions which can cause us some trouble. The first one is other people cause my feelings. We need to remember that feelings are connected to our cognitive appraisals or how we interpret situations. We can mentally distort things by focusing on negatives or through polarized thinking, which is thinking in terms of black and white or right and wrong, which can lead us to overlook gray areas. We may jump to conclusions. Another cognitive distortion is catastrophizing or making a mountain out of a molehill. We may blame others for our problems, or we may engage in emotional reasoning, where there's a lack of rational reasoning, and where we believe that simply because we feel a certain way, that it must be true. The important point here is that if you believe that other people cause your feelings, you've given them power and control over your feelings, and you've given up responsibility for managing your own feelings. The second myth, it is best if I deny my feelings, is unhelpful in conflict resolution because, as we mentioned earlier, feelings exist and they are important. Not being aware of your feelings may mean underlying issues don't get addressed. You may reach a concrete, very rational solution, but underlying emotions don't get resolved. The third myth, my feelings just happen to me, is related to the first one, but here you're at the mercy of your emotional reactions, and you overlook how your own thinking and perceptions contribute to how you feel. Let me suggest that rather than being at the mercy of your emotions, that you instead consider your emotions as tools in conflict resolution. They can help us to engage with the other party or parties and communicate more effectively so we can understand where everyone's coming from. Our emotions are created by our thoughts and how we perceive the environment. And every emotion has an underlying message which reflects the perception that created it. This is important because by reading the emotion and understanding the message, we can talk about how a person perceives his or her situation. This then facilitates engagement and the development of new perspectives. And when a perception changes, the emotion changes. The text discusses the evolutionary value of emotions. One reason emotions are useful is they get us to act quickly in response to danger. Although rational thinking helps us a lot, it is sometimes too slow for handling a threat. Sometimes we have to react more quickly, and our emotions, like fear, help us to do that and help us to survive. One of the most powerful emotions we can feel is anger. It is considered a social emotion because it is a strong feeling of displeasure connected to a perceived unfairness or injustice. We might say we're angry at a driver who doesn't signal before crossing lanes, or a store clerk who drops our groceries, or even corrupt politicians. It's termed the moral emotion because it is based on a fast, reflective judgment that we have been wronged or threatened. Anger is rooted in reason. Both the head and the heart are involved. Both feed off of each other. There is an interpretation that another person's actions were unjust and create some sort of threat. We then feel angry, which affirms our perception. We may not be aware of our thinking because the anger comes on so quickly and automatically. Anger serves a social function as it alerts us to circumstances which could pose a threat to our survival in the social world. Because there's an evaluation of the person's moral intentions and a judgment of unfairness or injustice, anger gives us the energy to respond to this situation by either avoiding it or confronting it. Venting is not an effective way of dealing with anger. Venting or expressing anger in an unrestrained way doesn't help eliminate it. Think of it this way. Letting the steam off of a boiling pot of water may help temporarily, but until the underlying issue or thinking that is heating up the water is turned down, the water will keep boiling and creating more steam. But anger as a tool does have a useful function. Anger can be a source of empowerment. It helps people set boundaries. It can be a wake-up call, a motivator, and an energizer. Now the text discusses the anger-fear sequence. In this model, anger is a secondary emotion. It is activated to deal with an underlying fear, which was triggered by a perceived threat. One example is being stuck in morning rush hour traffic and suddenly realizing you're going to be late for a very important meeting at work. You know you feel angry, but underneath the anger is fear that you will get in trouble with the boss or perhaps even lose your job. As adults, anger is a more socially acceptable emotion than fear because fear leads us to experience vulnerability. Another way to understand the dynamics of fear and anger, or anger as a secondary emotion, is to imagine a tree. The root of anger or underlying anger are fear and pain. These emotions are below the surface. However, what we see on the outside is anger. Fear and pain are fueling the anger. Hocker and Wilmot provide excellent examples of anger situations on pages 203 and 204, which will help you to apply this concept. One of the objectives in this unit is to understand that conflicts kept in the mid-range level of emotional intensity are handled more effectively. It is in this mid-range that we have the greatest potential for productive conflict. Unexpressed conflict means denying your emotions, and ultimately the conflict is not resolved. Moderated emotions or regulated conflict will stop escalatory spirals, and you'll be able to think more clearly while at the same time emotionally engaging. This is where you have the greatest potential for productivity. Unrestrained conflict is ineffective because blowing up leaves people feeling bad and dissatisfied with any eventual outcome. Since anger is such a powerful emotion, it's important to learn to express anger responsibly. There are 4 steps that can help. First, verbally state the anger. Say, I feel angry. Don't leave the other person guessing. Secondly, simply acknowledge your anger rather than venting. 3, agree on a process goal. Agree to never attack each other in a state of anger. And 4, work to find the underlying reason for the anger. It doesn't go away simply because it is expressed. Finding the right words to express anger can be difficult. The XYZ formula can help. It goes like this. When you do X and identify a specific behavior in situation Y and carefully describe and objectively describe the situation, I feel Z and simply identify how you feel. This way, you take ownership of your emotions and clarify what produced the emotions. Let's move on to the next chapter, Analyzing Your Conflicts. Systems theory provides a way to understand conflicts by looking at the entire system and subsystems in organizations, small groups, and families. It is a macro-level analysis which doesn't look at blame or who is at fault, but identifies processes which keep conflicts going. The key concepts are wholeness, or looking at the entire system, organization, rather than seeing a collection of individuals, they are seen as functioning as a unit. Each person is part of a relational system. The third concept is patterning. Recurring conflicts follow patterns. We can answer the question, how does this work, by uncovering system patterns, such as triangles and coalitions. By making system changes based on conflict analysis, which affect communication patterns, we can find conflict resolution. Systems theory seeks to discover the rules that govern the system's behavior and the function that the conflict serves within the system. Just as we as individuals develop patterns of behavior, so do systems. Systems develop characteristic communication patterns, and understanding these patterns can help us understand the function that the conflict serves. I'm going to highlight just a couple of the basic principles of systems theory to help you as you study this chapter. First, systems operate as an interdependent unit. There's a concept called homeostasis, which refers to keeping the system intact. If someone does try to change their role, others will adapt to keep the system intact. They will compensate, or they will resist any change the person is making. People in a system are assigned specific roles, and the system works to keep the people in their assigned roles. Systems develop rules for conflict that, no matter how dysfunctional, are followed as long as the basic structure of the system does not change. Let me give you an example. In the treatment of an individual addicted to alcohol or other drugs, we know that it's important to treat the entire family because the family system has adopted certain rules and roles to keep the system intact and operating when the person was using. Now that he or she is not using, There's a vacuum or a change in the system. The rules and the roles in the previous system are going to be followed by family members if they're not treated, and they worked when the person was actively using. And if the recovering person is put back into this dysfunctional system, there can be a risk of relapse. Systems theory has been very helpful in the treatment of alcoholism and other drug addictions. Systems with intense relationships tend to produce triangles. Triangles behave in predictable and sometimes toxic ways over time. Whenever two people are in a conflict and a third person is brought into it, it becomes a conflict triangle. Sometimes this third person becomes a buffer, diffusing some of the conflict or alleviating some of the tension. But more often, these triangles become toxic and keep the conflict going. If the triangle has the potential to damage the relationship between the two people, it is considered a toxic triangle. Communication between two conflicted individuals is difficult enough. Bring in a third person, and communication is even more complex. The third person may form a coalition with one of the parties and affect the balance of power. The two in the conflicted relationship may speak to each other through the third party rather than to each other, where they could work through the conflict. Now, a big concept in systems theory is circular causality. It's based on the idea that we are in a constant feedback loop with the persons in our lives. Linear causal explanations will try to find out who started it, who's at fault, or who's to blame. Circular causal explanations, on the other hand, will try to understand what each person is doing that sustains the problem and what they can do differently to change the situation. So circular causality understands conflicts in systems as operating through an ongoing feedback loop, as you see in the bottom diagram. A conflict is sustained by the cooperation of its members. It takes two to tango, going back to our metaphor that conflict is a dance. In systems theory, finding the beginning or cause is less important than finding the patterns in the conflict process. In order to most effectively analyze conflicts, we need descriptions of the smaller details in addition to overall system views. So in addition to the wide lens view, we need a smaller lens view to see how interactions contribute to system dynamics. In this micro-level analysis, there are two approaches: micro-events and interaction rules. Let's start with interaction rules. These are a set of unstated but powerful rules that limit genuine change. Another important aspect of interaction rules is they are implicit rules of communication. In other words, these rules are unspoken, but they have developed to keep the system intact. And those rules are prescriptive. For example, don't complain, don't talk about whatever it is, or never disagree with dad. The rules are prescriptive in that they tell members what they should do. And when they're brought to the surface, these rules can be changed. Some steps for bringing system rules to the surface are mentioned in the text. Micro-events are another approach to micro-level analysis. They are similar to rules, but descriptive rather than prescriptive in nature. They describe representative episodes of interaction in conflicts. You get a sense of "here we go again" when they occur. They are repetitive loops of observable interpersonal behavior with a redundant outcome. These communication patterns often cycle back and forth and keep people trapped in a conflict. And this is important, they give information about other interactions. Not every interaction is a micro event. Just to clarify, let's consider the analogy of rain. Very small amounts of water from rain is in the form of drops, and larger amounts combine to form puddles. Micro events, the drops, can pool into larger conflicts, just as drops make up a puddle. Only through observing the greater content or through a system-wide perspective can we know if a micro event is part of a larger conflict or if it stands alone. To conclude this presentation, I want to review the 4 stages of conflict. Philip Guerin was a student of Murray Bowen, and as a psychiatrist, he applied this model to the evaluation and treatment of marital conflict. He identified 4 stages or manifestations of conflict. With a team of researcher clinicians from the Center for Family Learning in New York, they developed a conceptual framework to assess and match treatment to each couple's particular problem. They found that troubled couples tend to fall into one of 4 categories, and each is best suited to a particular treatment approach. Stage 1, there is minimal conflict, open communication, and sharing power. There are just mild conflicts and no significant distress for the system. In stage 2, there is significant conflict that is seen as causing a problem. Criticism increases, but there's still little power polarization, and distress appears. In stage 3, there is frequent criticism of each other. The members are unable to exchange information accurately, and they engage in highly intense interactions, and there are serious power struggles and polarization. Stage 4 shows the loss of ability to work through their conflict, and they have engaged the services of a third party. In this stage, they appear headed toward disengagement and divorce.